The wind moves quietly over the desert plains of Persia, carrying with it echoes of an empire built not merely on war, but on will. Not just on might, but on measure. Not simply on conquest, but on vision. Darius, called the Great, King of Kings, builder of roads, writer of laws, weaver of lands and peoples into a thing called empire. But before the glory, there was a coup. Before the monuments, there was a knife in the dark. And before the order, there was chaos. His reign was not birthed in peace, but in the turbulence of a world falling apart. The son of a minor noble thrust into the fire of succession. He did not inherit greatness. He constructed it with ink and blade, with stone and silence, with faith and fear and unfaltering design. To walk through the empire of Darius is to follow the first deep footsteps of what the world would come to call civilization. Postal systems, taxation, infrastructure, tolerance, imperial unity, all rising from a mind that looked far ahead and saw not just a kingdom, but a legacy. This is not merely the story of a king. This is the story of what it means to rule and to be remembered. So sit with the past a while. Let the winds of Persepolis stir the dust, and in that dust find a name: Darius the Great. And if this journey moves you, perhaps consider subscribing so you never miss another step into history's quieter echoes. The sun baked the road to Susa until the stones cracked beneath the hooves of horses. Dust curled like steam behind every rider, blurring the line between earth and sky. Persia, vast and fractured, had once again found itself in the hands of uncertainty. Cambyses, son of Cyrus, had died far from home, and in his absence a whisper took root, a whisper that would become a ghost. That ghost bore a name: Smerdis. The man who claimed to be the brother of Cambyses sat upon the throne. He issued proclamations. He canceled tributes. He warmed himself in the loyalty of a confused court. But not all believed. Some eyes watched closely. Among them, a soldier named Darius. Young, broad-shouldered, eyes like flint. He had been close to Cambyses. He had seen the real Smerdis. He knew this man was not him. But knowledge alone is not power, not in Persia, not then. Cambyses had died en route from Egypt, perhaps by his own hand, perhaps by fate. His empire, as grand as it had grown, now stood on a precipice, its heart unsure, its governors restless, its future unwritten. Into this trembled world rode Darius. He gathered allies, not in secret, but with calculation. 6 noblemen, the 7 Persians they would be called, each with blood thick in their veins and ambition thinly veiled. In hushed rooms, over clinking goblets and oil-lit maps, they plotted the unmasking. They would strike not for chaos, but for order. not for vengeance, but for truth. The day they entered the palace, the air was still as a tomb. No courtiers chattered, no musicians played. There was only the soft rhythm of sandals over polished stone, and the dull thud of hearts filled with purpose. They found the impostor in his chamber, calm, draped in royal linen, staring into a silver mirror that reflected not a king, but a lie. The blade fell quickly. No speeches, no ceremony, just the end of a deception that had nearly torn Persia apart. But a dead pretender leaves behind more than silence. He leaves behind a throne. Among the seven, a question pulsed like a second heartbeat. Who would wear the crown? Who among them had the right, not by birth, but by breath, by fire, by resolve? They argued, they debated. Some spoke of rotation, others of elections, of tradition, of omens. One suggested the gods decide. Horses, they agreed. At dawn, the horse whose whinny echoed first would choose the king. And so, Darius, clever as he was steady, leaned on more than luck. His groom, discreet and loyal, led his horse to the spot before sunrise. There, he allowed the animal to sense the scent of a mare in heat, hidden nearby. At dawn, the stallion neighed first. The omen was red. The crown was his. Perhaps it was trickery. Perhaps destiny wears many masks. But when Darius stood beneath the rising sun, golden light lacing the curls of his beard, the others bowed. He had not seized the crown. He had earned it. The road ahead, though, was jagged. Even as the court accepted him, even as Ahura Mazda was invoked in his name, rebellion stirred like embers under ash. Elam, Babylon, Media, Egypt. Provinces rose, claiming autonomy, disbelieving his right. Some cried that their local kings were still alive. Others rallied around false claimants. The empire, once whole, was splitting like clay dried too quickly in the sun. Darius did not retreat. He did not pause. He rode. From one province to the next, he quelled uprisings with swiftness and clarity. Not with blind cruelty, but with method. He understood something essential. Loyalty was built not only through blood and fear, but through structure, through the sense that beneath him there was order, and above all, purpose. And so, between battles, he began to write. Stone, once a canvas for king's glory, now became the parchment of law. Darius had inscriptions carved deep into cliffsides, truths made permanent. I am Darius the king, they began, not with arrogance, but with certainty. These are the lands I have held, these the people I have ruled. In Behistan, high above a road that cut through the Zagros mountains, he etched his legacy, his battles, his enemies, his right to rule. Figures bowed before him in stone, not just in homage, but in acknowledgement. This man did not rise from chaos, he restored from it. What sets Darius apart is not the blood he shed, but the shape he gave to the chaos he inherited. He did not merely sit the throne of Cyrus. He stabilized it, strengthened it, stretched it farther. This was only the beginning, for in the quiet moments between war and decree, Darius saw something few rulers dared to dream. He saw a new kind of empire. Not just Persian, not just Median, but unified. Power, once taken, must be secured, not just by the sword, but by the soul of the realm. Darius stood at the center of a fractured world, the echo of his rise still trembling across the empire's far edges. Babylon smoldered with unrest. Elam whispered rebellion. In the mountains, false kings claimed old names, rising like weeds through the cracks of fractured unity. But Darius was not shaken. He understood that loyalty was not born, it was forged, like bronze in fire, like friendships in war. And so he turned not only to armies, but to oaths. It began with the 7. The men who had drawn their blades with him against the impostor were not mere accomplices. They were nobles, commanders, guardians of ancient houses with their own ambitions, their own reach. They could be rivals, or they could be something rarer, pillars, with Darius as roof. He brought them close, not with flattery, but with trust. Positions of power, command over armies, marriages that bound blood to blood. In a kingdom where betrayal was easy and honor harder still, he chose to believe in brotherhood. And in doing so, he laid the bones of something lasting. Still, beyond the court, belief in him was far from settled. His enemies spoke not with one voice, but with 10. 10 false kings, 10 claims to power. Some invoked gods, others lineage, others rage. They branded Darius a usurper, a pretender, a trickster with a stallion and a sly groom. Darius answered not with words, but with steel. The campaigns were swift, brutal, strategic. Darius did not rush from province to province like a man chasing flames. He moved like a builder, stamping out cracks before the whole structure collapsed. He rode into Elam, into Media, into Babylon, each a wound, each sutured by discipline and message. Not every victory was clean. At Babylon, he faced Nebuchadnezzar's ghost, a man claiming descent, stirring old pride. Twice the city rose, and twice Darius crushed it. He ordered the city's gates sealed, the walls breached, the false king hanged. Not with cruelty for cruelty's sake, but with precision. Let none mistake silence for peace. Let the price of rebellion be remembered. Yet Darius knew fear alone would not hold an empire. Fear was brittle, it broke. What he needed was faith. And so he turned to the oldest force in Persia, the sacred. Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, creator of truth, keeper of cosmic order. Darius did not merely invoke the god. He declared himself his chosen instrument, not as a prophet, not as a priest, but as a king who ruled because he aligned with divine order. He began his proclamations not with boasts, but with the solemn cadence of devotion. By the will of Ahura Mazda, I am king. To disobey Darius, then, was not only to betray a ruler, it was to rupture harmony with the very fabric of creation. He built temples, funded priests, restored Zoroastrian fire altars in forgotten towns. Yet, remarkably, he did not demand conversion. That was not his way. In lands of many gods, Babylonian, Egyptian, Elamite, he allowed the rites to continue, provided they did not challenge the throne. Unity through tolerance, but also through clarity. There was a center now, and he was it. He then turned to structure. The empire was a mosaic of tongues, faiths, and customs. To rule it meant more than marching across it. It meant understanding it, mapping it, giving it form. He divided the realm into satrapies, administrative districts, each ruled by a satrap or governor. These men owed their loyalty to the king, their coffers to the royal treasury, and their vigilance to the empire's integrity. Taxation became regularized, tribute recorded, roads watched. Spies, the eyes and ears of the king, moved silently from province to province, ensuring loyalty not just in public, but in private. The system was vast, elegant, ruthless when needed. A spider's web strung across a continent, with Darius at its patient, purposeful center. And then there was language. Persia spoke many tongues, but Darius chose one to carve his truths. Old Persian, newly formalized, etched alongside Elamite and Babylonian cuneiform. At Behistun, on that sheer cliffside, he told the world his story in triplicate, an imperial Rosetta, meant to be read, believed, and remembered. The story he told was not just his, it was the empire's, a tale of false kings undone, of chaos defeated, of divine approval secured. It was propaganda, yes, but also testimony to ambition, to vision, to the need not simply to rule, but to justify rule. And people listened. In cities once defiant, taxes began to flow. Roads reopened. Governors took their oaths in his name. In distant Sogdiana and arid Arachosia, traders no longer asked who ruled. They knew. The King of Kings. But Darius was not content with restoration. That would have made him a caretaker. He aimed higher. He would be a creator of empire, of order, of a world that did not simply endure, but functioned. And yet, beneath all the structure, the stone, the sacred rites, lay a simple truth. Darius had nearly lost it all before he'd even begun. He knew this. He carried it like a scar behind the eyes. In council halls, on battlefields, at sacred ceremonies. He remembered the impostor's face, the silence before the knife fell, the hollow thud of a corpse whose only crime was pretending too well. Perhaps that's why Darius moved with such precision. He had once stepped so close to the abyss, he learned never to leave anything to chance again. Blood had opened the door, but it was oaths, sworn, broken, rewritten, that kept him inside. And behind each oath was a man who understood that greatness is never given. It is built, stone by stone, law by law, oath by oath. The crown Darius wore was more than gold and ornament. It was weight, expectation, shape. And shape, he understood, was everything. An empire that stretches from the Nile to the Indus cannot breathe chaos. It must be sculpted like clay into something with structure, something that will stand once the hands are removed. In this, Darius was not merely a king. He was a potter of nations. He began with what lay closest to the throne, the court. Gone were the informal clusters of advisors, the irregular whispers of hereditary power. Darius formalized the machinery of state. Roles were assigned, chains of command drawn like lines on parchment. Administrators no longer served simply by proximity, but by record, merit, and loyalty. The palace no longer functioned as a family home. It became an engine. From that engine flowed an idea, a state that could replicate itself even at a distance. To govern far-off Egypt, or the Black Sea coast, or Bactria in the mountains, was to govern without being there. So he created satrapies, not just in title, but in practice. Each governed by a satrap, a regional viceroy with broad powers, and watched by royal inspectors. These were not wild governors, they were trained links in a living chain. And they were bound not just to the king, but to the system itself. Justice, too, needed its shape. Darius ordered a codification of the empire's laws, not to erase local customs, but to organize them, to place them under a canopy of imperial structure. Babylonian traditions, Egyptian rites, Persian edicts, all acknowledged, but now arranged like tiles in a single mosaic. For the first time, a farmer in Lydia and a merchant in Susa could know what was expected of them. They could know the taxes, the penalties, the protections. It was not equality, not in our modern sense, but it was consistency. And in a realm so vast, consistency was revolution enough. But rules require movement, and movement requires roads. Darius looked upon the dusty trade routes of Cyrus and saw more than simple paths. He saw arteries. He ordered them widened, paved, protected. The royal road, stretching over 1,600 miles, linked Sardis to Susa. Couriers could ride its length in 7 days, changing horses at stations along the way. No one had moved messages so quickly, so far. This was no mere postal route. It was the empire's nervous system. From these roads, commerce blossomed. Goods crossed borders with ease. Textiles, spices, ideas. Coins bearing Darius's image passed from one end of the empire to another. He introduced a standardized gold currency, the Daric, marked with the king as archer. It was not just a coin, it was a symbol of trust, of reach, of imperial cohesion. Even time itself bent toward order. Darius reformed the calendar, adjusting it to align with solar cycles. Religious festivals, agricultural schedules, taxation deadlines, all could now be tracked with greater precision. It was another thread drawn tight in the tapestry of rule. Yet all this precision was not cold. It was not detached. Darius did not simply impose structure from above. He listened, he traveled, he absorbed. In Egypt, he presented himself as a pharaoh, not merely in costume, but in ritual. He restored temples, consulted priests, completed irrigation projects begun by others. The Egyptians, though wary, found in him a ruler who respected their gods, even as he worshipped his own. In Babylon, he rebuilt canals and walls destroyed in war. He respected the city's grandeur while never allowing it to become a rival. He gave it pride, but not independence. In Media, his own homeland, he honored the traditions of his ancestors, but insisted they serve the empire, not merely their tribe. Everywhere he went, Darius did the same: absorb, reform, unify. He was not trying to erase cultures. He was trying to make them fit, like bricks in a wall that wouldn't fall. And while he organized the living, he also considered the eternal. The tomb at Naqsh Rustam began to take shape. Hewn into a cliff face, it rose with quiet grandeur. No statues, no golden coffin, just a cross-shaped facade, carved with scenes of kingship, justice, and prayer. Beneath it, a chamber sealed from time, waiting for the end. There he would rest someday, not in a palace, but in stone. As permanent as the laws he wrote, as unmoving as the road beneath a courier's horse. But Darius was not yet finished, because an empire, however well ordered, must not only exist, it must be seen. And so he began to plan something else. Not a road, not a system, not a coin. A city. Not a city of the past like Babylon, not a city of conquest like Susa. A city of vision. Persepolis. There, at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, he would raise the capital not of administration, but of symbolism. Not the brain of the empire, but its heart. It would take years, it would stretch beyond his life, but its foundations began under his hand. To rule, Darius believed, was not just to command. It was to organize, to clarify, to shape. And that shape, the one he pressed into clay and coin, into law and stone, would endure. Even when the crown fell, even when the kingship passed, even when memory faded, the structure would remain. Because Darius had not ruled for today, he had ruled for what came after. The empire was not a dream. It was a map. And Darius, more than any king before him, understood that power must be measured to be real. He did not see lines on parchment as decoration. He saw them as instruments, tools of control. He understood that to govern well, you must know the shape of what you govern, its length and width, its mountains and mouths, its languages, weights, and wounds. So he began to chart it. The empire stretched across 3 continents, from the deserts of Libya to the snowy ridges of the Hindu Kush, from the Black Sea down to the Arabian sands. It absorbed Elamite engineers, Ionian scribes, Assyrian warriors, Egyptian priests, and Median horsemen, and Darius wanted to know all of them. At his command, royal surveyors set out, not to conquer, but to record. They noted terrain, climates, resources, where the barley grew thickest, where the copper gleamed, where the rivers choked in spring floods. This was not idle curiosity. It was the architecture of strategy. Because with information came clarity, and with clarity, control. He used this knowledge to finalize the satrapies, 20 of them, each one distinct, each one responsible. He calculated their wealth, their output, their obligations. No longer would tribute be based on vague gestures. Now each region had numbers, fixed sums, expectation. India, rich in gold dust, was to send 20 talents by weight. Babylon, lush and ancient, paid in silver and grain. Egypt gave wheat, linen, papyrus. The highlands of Armenia sent horses prized for war. Even distant Gandhara, where the language twisted the tongue, contributed soldiers and spices. It was a masterpiece of economic design. And yet, it did not crush the local. It balanced it. Each region could breathe in its own way, but always, always under the same sky. The great king's sky. And beneath that sky, the empire moved. Goods flowed faster than ever before. Timber from Lebanon roofed palaces in Susa. Lapis lazuli from Bactria adorned jewelry in Persepolis. Greek marble, Indian ivory, Arabian incense, all pulsed through the veins of roads Darius had paved. This was no longer just a kingdom. It was a system. Even its enemies could not help but marvel. In the writings of later Greeks, Herodotus especially, there is both admiration and unease. They describe the empire with awe and suspicion. Its couriers fast as the gods. Its order almost unnatural. Its king distant yet unpresent. And perhaps Darius preferred it that way. To be visible everywhere, yet remain unseen. To be present in the seal on a scroll, the weight of a coin, the reliability of the calendar.
This was not rule through spectacle. It was rule through expectation. But maps are not only physical, they are also cultural. Darius understood that language had power, not only as a means of communication, but as a mirror of authority. So he commissioned inscriptions in multiple tongues: Old Persian, Elamite, Babylonian, later even Greek. He made no attempt to erase identity. Instead, he surrounded it with something larger, with a shared mythos of order over chaos, of empire as a divine reflection. He did not demand sameness. He demanded orientation. And so the people turned, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes gladly, toward the throne. Yet Darius was not content to remain within his lines. The map he had drawn was vast, but it was not yet complete. To the north lay lands unknown. To the west, islands that whispered of rising city-states. To the east, jungles and rivers that mocked understanding. The horizon called to him, not out of greed, but out of restlessness. He was a builder, and builders expand. So he reached toward the lands beyond Thrace, sending envoys, troops, mapmakers, into Scythia, across the Danube, toward the edge of what could be imagined. These were not always victories. Some campaigns stalled. Some forces returned bruised, beaten. But even in failure, knowledge returned with them. New names, new dangers, new borders to be drawn. To Darius, this was enough, because every failure taught him more about the world, and every scrap of knowledge became a tool. And from these tools came something unexpected, a consciousness of empire. For the first time, tens of millions of people across deserts, forests, deltas, mountains were aware of being part of something shared. A coin, a courier, a caravan guard. They all carried the echo of Darius's design. Even time began to bend around him. The regnal year became a marker. Events were not just remembered, they were placed, anchored. In Babylon, merchants dated their contracts by his reign. In Egypt, farmers marked their planting seasons against his harvest orders. In Persia, children were born beneath the name of a king whose rule they had never questioned, whose image they had never seen. Because it did not matter if they saw him. They lived within him, like breath inside a lung. This was his genius. He did not just map the world, he made the world feel mapped. A grid not of lines, but of trust, of repetition, of rhythm. And while kings before him had ruled men, Darius ruled systems. And systems, once made well, can outlast even the hand that made them.
A king may conquer with sword and law, but to endure, he must align with something greater than himself. Darius understood this with unshakable clarity. The lands he ruled worshipped 1,000 gods, from the sacred bulls of Egypt to the astral spirits of Babylon, from the fire temples of Persia to the storm deities of Asia Minor. The divine was not a single truth. It was a chorus. And if a king tried to silence that chorus, it would turn into thunder. So Darius listened, and then he spoke through it. He did not force the people to bow to Ahura Mazda. He did not destroy their temples or rewrite their prayers. Instead, he placed himself carefully, purposefully, at the center of a sacred narrative that stretched across cultures. In his eyes, he ruled not because he was strong or lucky or born of kingship. He ruled because order had chosen him, because he was aligned with Asha, truth, cosmic justice, divine balance. In Zoroastrian belief, the world is a battlefield between order and chaos, light and shadow, deceit and truth. And Darius, through word, stone, and silence, declared that he stood with order, that his rule was not merely a fact, but a correction of the chaos left behind by false kings and fractured provinces. He carved this message into rock. At Behistun, high above the road that wound through the Zagros Mountains, he had artisans chisel his story into the cliff face. There, he stood larger than life, bow in one hand, the other raised in righteous command. Before him, a line of bound rebels. Behind him, Ahura Mazda, floating in a radiant disk. It was more than art. It was theology. Darius did not speak as a god. He spoke as a servant of the divine order, one chosen, one tested, one victorious. This framing mattered. It gave his reign a moral architecture. It wasn't simply that he had won.
It was that he had restored what was right, that every tax paid, every road built, every rebellion quelled was not just politics, it was participation in the sacred maintenance of harmony. And yet, Darius was not blind to the power of spectacle. In every city he touched, from Babylon to Sardis, he left visual affirmations of his legitimacy. Reliefs of the King of Kings seated beneath a canopy of symbols, lotus flowers, winged discs, rows of tribute bearers from every corner of the known world. These images did not beg for loyalty, they presumed it. He began construction on palaces, not merely to dwell in, but to represent. To make the intangible ideal of empire into something you could walk through, touch, smell, fear, admire. Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon, and soon Persepolis. Here, at the edge of the empire's soul, Darius envisioned a city unlike any before it. A ceremonial capital, not a fortress, not a marketplace, but a stage. A place where kingship was not practiced, it was performed. The foundations rose from the stone like prophecy. Massive terraces, carved steps, colonnaded halls that would one day hold gifts from Nubia, wine from Phoenicia, lapis from Afghanistan. Every line of the city whispered the same truth, that this ruler was not a tyrant of blood, but a conductor of unity. And towering above it all, the idea that empire and divinity could mirror one another. Vast, ordered, benevolent, terrifying. Still, Darius did not retreat into ritual. He was not a man of incense and abstraction. He was practical, tactical. He saw religion not just as truth, but architecture, a frame to hold the complexity of empire. And so, when he entered Egypt, he offered not only governance, but restoration. Temples desecrated in war were rebuilt, priests reinstalled, old gods honored. Darius even claimed the title of pharaoh, not out of mockery, but in respect. In every relief carved during his reign, he is shown making offerings to Ra, to Osiris, to Thoth, not as a conqueror, but king among kings. The Egyptians, long used to foreign rule, recognized the difference. Darius ruled as if the gods mattered. In Babylon, he approached with equal care. Though he crushed rebellions, he allowed their gods to remain. Marduk still had his priests. The New Year's festival still ran its course. The message was always clear: worship as you must, so long as you obey. Darius's genius lay in this balance. He did not homogenize the sacred. He arranged it. As a steward, a custodian. One might think him cold, but there are moments, quiet ones, that suggest a deeper layer. In personal inscriptions, he speaks of Ahura Mazda not only as a god of justice, but a companion, a guiding presence, a force that watched his hand as he wrote, his blade as he struck, his voice as he ruled. He thanks the god not only for victory, but for clarity, as if what he feared most was not failure, but confusion, disorder, noise. And perhaps that's what the divine gave him, not comfort, but certainty. In a world of shifting alliances, of foreign tongues, of eternal uprisings and ceaseless roads, he needed a fixed point, something immovable. And in Ahura Mazda, he found it. But faith is not always reciprocated. Gods are distant, people closer. And though Darius ruled with precision, not all loved him. There were still murmurs, still questioners. Some saw him as a manipulator, a fraud in holy robes. Others feared his calm more than they had ever feared the chaos. Yet even they could not deny the result. From the cliffs of Behistun to the rising steps of Persepolis, Darius had taken a realm of scattered fragments and drawn it into orbit. Not just through law, not just through fear, but through a story of gods and kings, of order over chaos, of a man who believed that power, true power, must be justified.
To last. In the cradle of the mountains, where the land rises like a breath held by the earth, Darius chose a place. Not for war, not for defense, but for permanence. Persepolis. Its name would echo through time, through fire, through ash. But in the beginning, it was silence. Only wind, rock, and the soft murmur of springs weaving through the soil. Darius did not build Persepolis to govern. He already had Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon. He did not build it for war. No walls, no high towers to shoot from. He built it for something rarer. He built it for ceremony. He built it for memory. Here, among the dust and stone, he would carve not just a city, but a symbol. The first stones were laid carefully. No mad rush of construction, no shouts or chaos, just the methodical rhythm of work guided by vision. Massive platforms were cut into the mountain base, each one a promise of what would rise. Terraces like stages, foundations like the spine of a myth. And then columns, not just tall, monumental. Their shafts rising skyward like spears offered to the heavens, each crowned with capitals of stylized bulls and lions, staring out across the plain with calm power. Their gaze was not aggressive, it was eternal. They did not guard the city, they defined it. Everything about Persepolis was deliberate. The materials came from every corner of the empire. Cedar from Lebanon, gold from Lydia, ivory from India, lapis from Bactria, stone from the Zagros themselves. Each brick, each beam, each painted frieze told the same story. This was not a Persian city, it was an imperial one. The Apadana, great audience hall of Darius, rose at the center like a throne turned into architecture. 72 columns, enough to hold not just a roof, but an idea. Carved into the stairways, a procession, tribute bearers from every satrapy. Ethiopians with gold rings, Medes with textiles, Elamites with beasts, Scythians with horses, Indians with spices, Greeks with weapons. They walk not as slaves, not as defeated, but as honored participants in a system larger than themselves. They climb the steps not in chains, but in ceremony. This was Darius' vision of empire, etched into stone.
Diversity, yes, but arranged. Celebrated, but controlled. A tapestry where every thread had its place. And at the center, the king. Unmoving, unblinking. A figure not of passion, but of presence. Here, in Persepolis, time itself bent towards symbolism. The New Year festival, Nowruz, was not just a celebration. It became a ritual of unity. Once a year, delegations from across the empire ascended the steps, entered the hall, and offered gifts to the King of Kings. But the gifts were not the point. The gesture was. The image of harmony, of submission transformed into participation. Darius understood this. He knew that empire is not held only by armies. It is held by rhythm, by performance, by repetition. And Persepolis was the stage.
The city also became a workshop of artisans, stonecutters, masons, scribes, all employed for decades to bring the vision to life. There were tablets written in Elamite and Aramaic detailing rations paid to workers, salaries to women and men alike. This was not slavery, it was administration. Even labor was drawn into the great mechanism of empire. Here, too, the sacred was honored, not with towering temples, but with intimacy. Fire altars dotted the terraces, their flames tended carefully, quietly. The Zoroastrian devotion to light and purity echoed in the very layout of the city. Open skies, clean lines, balance in proportion. Darius would not live to see it finished. He knew this. He built it anyway, because Persepolis was not for him. It was for those who came next. For Xerxes, his son, for Artaxerxes, for Darius III, for the names that would rise and fall like wind over the stones. He was not building a palace. He was building continuity. And in doing so, he created something more enduring than conquest. Even centuries later, when Alexander came, drunk with fire and grief, and lit the halls of Persepolis aflame, he could not erase the intention behind the stone. The walls still stood, yes, but defiant. And the procession carved in the staircases, still walking, still climbing, still offering. Because Persepolis was never just a place. It was an idea, a memory carved into mountains, a declaration that empire, true empire, is not a matter of force, but of form. Darius, the builder, the organizer, the man who dreamed not of dominance, but of design. And in that design, he revealed a rare truth, that greatness does not scream, it stands. And sometimes it stands long after the voice has faded.
Not all frontiers are made of walls. Some are made of wind. To the north of Persia lay a land that defied the pen, the plow, and the road. Scythia. It was a world of grasses and silence, stretching far beyond what maps could name. A horizon that moved when you tried to chase it. Home to riders who carried no fixed borders, only bows and memory. And Darius, ever the map maker, the shaper, the builder, could not leave that horizon unchallenged. He had conquered kings, codified provinces, raised cities from stone. But here was something different. A people without walls, without kings, without temples or satraps. Here was chaos uncontained, a mirror in which empire saw its limits. And so Darius decided to ride into it. The preparations were immense. Bridges built across the Bosporus, provisions hauled over mountains, armies drawn from every satrapy, Medes, Persians, Egyptians, Ionians, Lydians, marching north like a tide that could not be stopped. Darius was not chasing gold, he was chasing certainty. The Scythians, he believed, must be either brought into order or broken. But the Scythians did not wait in palaces. They did not send envoys. They watched from the horizon, and they moved. Darius crossed the Danube, built pontoon bridges across rivers that curled like serpents through the steppe. He marched always forward into emptiness, and the Scythians retreated. Not once did they meet him in open battle. Instead, they burned their own fields, poisoned their wells, left behind only wind and distant silhouettes on horseback. It was a campaign not of conquest, but of pursuit. And pursuit, Darius soon realized, can turn into a kind of madness. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The supply lines stretched like over-tightened strings. Horses began to die. Men began to falter. There were no cities to occupy, no symbols to claim. Only more steppe, more dust, more silence. The Scythians, in their own strange way, were teaching Darius a lesson. Not all power can be absorbed. Not every rhythm yields to empire. They sent him messages, taunting, clever. A bird, a frog, a mouse, a handful of arrows. Each one a riddle, a metaphor, a refusal. Even their silence had meaning. Darius, not a man known for rashness, began to recalculate. He had proven his reach, he had shown his might, but the further he went, the less he held. And so he turned back. Some historians would call it a failure, a retreat, a moment where the empire blinked. But perhaps Darius saw it differently. Perhaps he understood that wisdom sometimes lies in recognizing the edge of order. He had walked into a space that refused to be shaped, and rather than shatter himself against it, he returned. Still, he did not forget. He ordered fortresses built near the frontier, garrisons placed along the northern rim. The memory of the Scythians became part of his map, not as a conquered land, but as a limit, a warning carved in wind. The Danube became a boundary not just of territory, but of empire's reach, a place where roads ended, where law turned quiet. And yet, in the wake of it, Darius did what he always did. He turned the experience into structure. He learned. The campaign into Scythia revealed the fragility of extended supply lines, the danger of assuming all enemies would fight the same way, the value of adaptability. Back in Persia, reforms followed. Logistics tightened. Garrison networks expanded. Communications accelerated. His empire, once stretched thin in the north, began to grow leaner, more agile. The lesson had cost him months, lives, and pride. But it had bought him foresight. Still, it left a mark. Not on his monuments. Darius rarely acknowledged failure in stone. But in his planning, in his tone, in the quiet way Persepolis became more central after the campaign. The north had not bent. And so he looked west, toward Ionia, toward the Aegean, toward the cities of restless Greeks who had once served his father's empire and now whispered of independence. Scythia had evaded the net, but others could still be drawn in. The gamble in the north had not been in vain. It had reminded the King of Kings that even the greatest map has edges. And those edges must be approached not with arrogance, but with awareness. Because in every empire, there comes a moment when expansion ceases to be glory and becomes a question. And for Darius, the question was no longer how far he could go. It was how long what he had built would last.
There are sparks that come from steel, and there are sparks that come from pride. Ionia had once bowed, not gladly, but pragmatically. These were the cities of the western coast, Greek in language, in spirit, in pride. Ephesus, Miletus, Sardis, cities of stone theaters and sea-salted ports, where ideas moved as quickly as ships. They had been absorbed into the empire under Cyrus, kept orderly under Cambyses, and now, under Darius, expected more than silence. But Darius, ever the weaver of systems, saw Ionia not as exceptional, but as a thread, one of many, a province among provinces. And in that subtle shift, something cracked. It began as many rebellions do, not with armies, but with resentment. The satrap in Sardis was harsh. The local tyrants, installed with Persian blessing, ruled with greed and detachment. Taxes bit deeper, voices were muffled, and across the Aegean, the free cities of mainland Greece whispered their influence into Ionian ears. Then came Aristagoras, a name once minor, now etched in flame. The tyrant of Miletus, clever and opportunistic, attempted to seize Naxos with Persian aid. It failed. He panicked, and to save his own skin, he flipped the board, renouncing his tyranny, calling for rebellion, claiming liberation. The Ionians listened, not all at once, not with unity, but enough. Suddenly, the western edge of the empire was on fire, and behind it, in shadows and harbors, another hand stirred. Athens, a small city by Persian standards, but proud, ambitious, stubborn. They sent ships, not many, but enough to make a statement. Together, the Ionian rebels and their Athenian allies marched inland and did what few imagined possible. They burned Sardis, a capital, a symbol. Darius was not there, but he heard the fire. The temples, the market, the satrap's palace, all swallowed in smoke. The city that had stood as a gateway to Persia's west now smoldered.
And in that smoke, Darius saw not just rebellion, but disrespect. The Persians rebuilt Sardis quickly. The rebellion was not crushed in that moment, but the retaliation had begun. Persian generals moved west, methodically, relentlessly. Cities that had joined the uprising were besieged, sacked, punished. And yet, the rebellion clung to life longer than expected. Miletus fell last.
It was once a jewel of Ionia, rich in philosophers, traders, and poets. Now it was emptied. Its people deported, scattered into the folds of the empire. A warning carved in silence. Darius stood at the heart of it all, measured, unwavering. He did not lose his temper. He made no grand speeches. But he did something else. He asked a servant to repeat a phrase to him every night at dinner. "Master, remember the Athenians." Not out of hatred, out of principle. Because in Darius's mind, rebellion was not simply disobedience. It was a fracture in the great mirror he had spent a lifetime polishing. And Athens, distant, defiant Athens, had flung the first stone. He began to prepare, not rashly, not with fury, but with the cold deliberation of a man setting a wheel in motion. Troops were raised, ships constructed, logistics refined. The empire did not lurch, it turned. To Darius, Greece was not an urgent conquest. It was a necessary correction. He understood that ideas could be just as dangerous as armies. The Ionian revolt had not been powered by swords alone. It had been powered by belief in freedom, in autonomy, in identity. Such beliefs had to be acknowledged or extinguished. But even in the ashes of Ionia, a realization bloomed. Not every region would be soothed by roads and justice. Some would test the edges of empire, not for gold, not for land, but for the right to not belong. And so Darius shifted. The campaign westward became not just retribution, but preemption. He would strike not only the rebels, but the roots of rebellion. Athens would learn that empires do not forget. And yet, as preparations thickened, Darius remained composed. No rants, no declarations. He moved as he always had, with purpose. But beneath the purpose, something simmered. He had created a world where roads ran straight, coins weighed true, justice flowed downward like water from the mountains. And now, this, sparks in the west. He had conquered kings. He had crossed deserts, carved cities from stone, etched his laws into the cliffs of history. But now he would face something older, more primal, pride. And pride, as he would soon discover, does not burn like cities. It endures. The sea between Persia and Greece was not wide, but it was deep, with memory, with pride, with insult. Darius had not forgotten. Years had passed since the flames of Sardis first blackened the western wind, since Athenian ships dared land troops upon Persian soil. The Ionian revolt had been extinguished, but Athens remained untouched, and that
Darius could not abide. He did not rush. He prepared. The campaign to strike Greece was not born of fury. It was crafted piece by piece like one of his palaces. He summoned commanders, raised ships from Phoenicia and Egypt, called warriors from every satrapy, mounted archers from Bactria, spearmen from Elam, sailors from Cilicia. This was no mere raid. It was a message to Athens, to the world. He sent envoys first, diplomats bearing tokens of earth and water, symbols of submission. Some cities offered them freely, others hesitated. But in Athens and Sparta, the message was returned with scorn. In Athens, the envoys were thrown into a pit. In Sparta, into a well. Dig your earth there, they were told. So be it. Darius ordered the fleet westward. Led by his general Datis and with Artaphernes by his side, the expedition moved with precision. Island by island, they subdued the Cyclades, Naxos, Delos, Charistos. They burned temples, accepted surrender, restored order in Darius' name. And then they set their course for Euboea, and finally Attica. Eretria fell first. Betrayed from within, its people were enslaved, its walls broken. Next, Athens. The fleet landed in the Bay of Marathon, a long, open plain not far from the city. Flat, strategic, ideal for Persian cavalry. They waited. They expected Athens to cower. But Athens did not cower. Instead, the city sent its hoplites, every citizen who could bear a shield and spear, roughly 10,000 men, farmers, potters, smiths, stood against the empire. They were outnumbered, outarmed, untrained in the ways of imperial war, and yet they advanced. The Persians held the beach, their ships behind them, their cavalry poised, their archers ready. They had faced rebellions before. They had crushed cities greater than this. But what they faced at Marathon was something else. Not a rebellion, a refusal. The Athenians charged, not in scattered fear, but in a unified surge. The center bent, the flanks held, then curved inward and crushed. The Persian line, designed for broader plains and longer battles, faltered. Warriors fell. Ships were seized. The tide turned, not just of battle, but of history. Datis withdrew, a retreat, not annihilation, but defeat. Clean, stinging, undeniable. The Persians sailed home. Athens rejoiced. And in the great palace at Susa, the news arrived. Darius, king of kings, master of 50 million souls, had been resisted. Not by another empire, not by a conquering king, by a city, a single city. It was, by scale, a small loss, but symbolically, it was something more. It pierced the illusion of inevitability, and illusions, once pierced, do not mend. Still, Darius did not rage. He began again. Another campaign was planned, larger, more comprehensive.
Athens would fall, not in fury, but in correction. But fate, that old trickster, had another design. In the east, the seeds of rebellion stirred. In Egypt, proud, ancient, restless, new voices rose. And in the midst of planning vengeance, Darius had to turn. He would deal with the Nile before he dealt with the Aegean. But time, so often Darius's ally, betrayed him. The king grew older, his breath slower, his vision slightly dimmed. Still he wrote, still he ruled, still he planned. But the second invasion of Greece, his reckoning, would not be his to lead. It would fall to his son, Xerxes. And so Darius, the mapmaker, the builder, the organizer of half the known world, faced something he could not chart. An unfinished task, a moment left hanging. Marathon had not destroyed his empire, not even dented it. But it had left a shadow, a quiet, stubborn shadow stretching from a narrow beach all the way to his deathbed. Because for all he had built, for all the laws carved in stone, the roads that touched the seas, the cities that sang his name, Darius had learned the hardest lesson of empire, that even the greatest kings must choose their final horizon.
The halls of Persepolis grew quieter. No hammer rang, no chisels sang in the sun. The terraces still gleamed, the columns still stood, but the rhythm of construction had slowed. Darius was growing old, not frail, but reflective. The work of shaping an empire had given way to maintaining it, and even he, King of Kings, could feel the horizon creeping inward. He had ruled for decades, not as a tyrant, not as a god, but as a structure, a presence that moved beneath the surface of daily life, threading provinces together like a hidden spine. And now that presence was preparing to pass. He turned his mind to succession. There had been other sons, other heirs, but Xerxes was chosen, not simply because of blood, but because Darius saw in him the continuation of design. He prepared him with care, with counsel, not with indulgence, with responsibility. Xerxes was young, but the weight of the empire settled on his shoulders like fitted armor. He would carry forward the campaign against Greece. He would complete Persepolis. He would rule not as a warrior king, but as a guardian of form. Darius watched it all with quiet intensity. He issued final edicts, received final envoys. He walked the colonnades of Persepolis one last time, letting his hand brush the carved stone, stone that had risen not from ambition, but from belief. Then, in the royal fortress of Susa, sometime in the calm stillness before dawn, he slipped away. No thunder, no omens, just breath, exhaled for the last time. A servant covered the great king's body in linens. A priest whispered prayers to Ahura Mazda. Outside, the torches flickered in their sconces. The empire didn't pause. Roads still pulsed. Laws still held. But something had changed. Darius was gone. His body was carried to Nakhshe Rustam,
where the tomb he had commissioned awaited him. High in the cliff face, beneath the silent sky, the stone door was sealed. No golden pyramid, no towering mausoleum, just a cross-shaped facade etched with symbols of kingship, and a single message. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries, son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenid. It was not a boast. It was a structure.
A record for generations to come. And they did come. Xerxes ruled in his name. The empire endured. Persepolis grew. For another century, the Achaemenid dream held, until the fires of Macedon licked at its edges, and Alexander, son of Philip, rode in from the west. Alexander stood before Darius's tomb, a conqueror before a builder. He did not desecrate it. Some say he bowed. Others say he simply stared. But all agree he understood. Because even a man who tore down cities could recognize the quiet power of what had been made to last. And Darius had lasted, long after his armies disbanded, long after the gold coins stopped glinting in the sun, long after the roads cracked and the columns fell. He endured in the shape of things, in the idea that governance could be more than command, that empire could be more than conquest, that unity could be designed. He had turned chaos into code. He had taken dust and built from it a world. And though the wind would one day bury his name beneath centuries of conquest, rebellion, and retelling, beneath it all, the structure would remain. The taxes, the satraps, the road beneath the hoof, the idea that rule could be measured, balanced, justified. That is what he left behind. Not a crown, a pattern.
The wind moves differently where the old empires sleep. Not louder, not softer, just deeper. As if it carries more than dust, as if it remembers. And in that wind, somewhere between the worn stone of Persepolis and the silence of a cliffside tomb, a name still lingers. Darius. Not shouted, not sung, but felt in the smoothness of a road that refuses to crumble, in the shape of a law that bends but does not break, in the memory of a ruler who did not demand worship, only order. He did not begin as a conqueror. He became something rarer, a steward of vastness, a custodian of diversity, a weaver of peoples, coins, rituals, and time itself. Others chased glory. He built systems. And while marble fades, and gold is stolen, and memory twists beneath the weight of war and myth, some things endure in quieter ways. A road still walked, a law still echoed, a silence still honored. Darius did not leave behind a legacy of fire. He left one of form. And in that, he reminds us that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the shape of the world we no longer question. So let the dust settle, let the echoes fade, and know, beneath it all, there is a design and a name
carved deep beneath the centuries. Darius the Great.